we turned to the voice of the customer, really. And we started doing these long form conversational interviews that people at that point in time weren't thinking of music so much as a product, but more so as something that enhanced their daily life. Right before we launched it, one of my co-founders and I were walking home to the subway and we're like, this could be the end.
Now, this is a very special episode to me because Eric was the co-founder and CMO of Songza. Songza was my own personal favorite music streaming platform and app from 2011 all the way to 2016 when it was shut down. It revolutionized the music streaming industry with a streaming service that was free and without ads. In this episode, we talk about the complexities of building a product in an industry with massive incumbents, how he actually reduced features in his service to get happier customers, and how a focus on customer behavior
Always listen to the voice of the customer
led to Songza being sold to Google for multiple millions of dollars.
Hey Eric, so yeah, great to meet you. For folks who aren't familiar, what was your association with Songza? How long were you at Songza? Yeah, what's the background there?
So it's a little bit complicated. I joined with my co-founders before Songza existed. They had been running a digital download store called Amy Street, which they started in college at Brown and then moved to a suburban house in Long Island and then eventually into an office in Long Island City. And I had joined them while they were working out of the house in Long Island in a town called Hicksville. And initially, since I had a musical background, first as a musician and then secondarily working at a bunch of different organizations in the music business, I started working with them as kind of like a blogger and A&R person. So I used my musical knowledge to write newsletter write-ups and blog posts about the music that people were uploading to the site, call it reviews or blurbs to help promote and sell the music that the artists were selling on the service. And then I was also going out and recruiting artists and record labels and distributors to sell their music through the site. And that was in 2007 that I started working with them. About a year in, I think, music streaming started to emerge as a new way to consume music. YouTube launched, and in our own lives, we were using YouTube links to share music and songs with other people. And we saw this wave of streaming being sort of the new way that people would consume music. And we got interested in it. Ended up finding a company called Songza that was started by two people in Chicago. And what they had done was they had used APIs from places on the web that you could stream music for free. This was YouTube, other sites like iMeme, and I think LimeWire maybe, and a bunch of other places that you could get songs. And they created an aggregator of streaming music, and they marketed it as Google for Music. And you could go on the site, type in any song, and it would do its best to find that song for you. Those people who created Songza, the original Songza, they were technologists and designers. They weren't interested in the music rights complications and the IP law, etc., required to actually grow and scale and monetize a music streaming or music download service. And they had some traction. They had a good amount of users already using it and some attention on it. And we decided to actually acquire them. And for a while after that, we were simultaneously running both our download service and the original Songza. After that, we started experimenting a bit in the streaming space. Part of the impetus for that was because of the expenses associated with on-demand streaming. which was kind of a new space. And we had been versed in digital downloads, which has a completely different kind of royalty split and expectation as music streaming. And we saw an opportunity to experiment with radio streaming, which is different than on demand. So on demand, you can play any song when you want on repeat over and over again, put it on a playlist. In some instances, what people have become to expect as table stakes with the likes of Spotify, etc. You could download things, you can make playlists, you can do all kinds of really advanced things with on-demand streaming. But with radio streaming, it falls under a different kind of licensing requirement. And however, you lose a lot of the control. So we thought that there was maybe an opportunity to experiment with listening experiences that didn't require on-demand functionality. And so we spun out a variation of original Songza, as we called it, and we called it Songza Radio. And it was basically kind of like Pandora, in which you could type in an artist and it would play a radio station based on that artist. We also spun up a hyper editorialized version of Songza, which we called Songza Sets, which were these 6-song playlists with very, very specific themes and a lot of writing. So each playlist had a very specific title, like Feeling Good in the 90s. And it were these kinds of editorial trends in music and vibes that we picked up on based on our sort of encyclopedic knowledge of music. And we would come up with these titles and then a blurb about this genre that we had put together, and then a blurb on each individual song in the playlist as to what was so unique about it in that particular context. And so at that point, we had 4 different things going. We had the download store, the original Songza aggregator, the Songza radio, and Songza sets. And that was too much, especially for a small business that didn't necessarily have the kind of consumer traction and growth that we needed to at that stage. And so we started to focus more and more and more and more. And that resulted in offloading the download store, Amy Street, to one of our investors, which was Amazon. And so redirecting our user base there, doing that whole migration, and then further refining what we were doing with Songza. So we kind of combined all of the best things in all of those different Songza products into a new version of Songza. And this was in 2010. We relaunched it. And at that point in time, we still didn't really know what we were doing with it. We just kind of took the best of what we had learned. We had kind of combined it into a single service, which if you look at, I don't know if there's screenshots on the web of Songza 2010, but it's kind of a Frankenstein product. You can make your own playlists. You can make radio stations based on artists. You can listen to our playlists that we made that have these cool titles and themes. You could do collaborative playlists with other people. And when we launched that, we thought that it would take off, but it didn't necessarily grow in the way that we were hoping. And so as we started to look for answers, we turned to the voice of the customer, really. And we started doing these long form conversational interviews, really to just get inside the head and the lifestyles of prospective users and existing users. And for us, that was a real meaningful change in our process and our approach and our philosophy for how to create a product that was going to be useful and resonate with a large audience. And that kicking off that process led to sort of two phases of cumulative improvement to Songza. The first was, in having these interviews, we recognized that people at that point in time weren't thinking of music so much as a product, but more so as something that enhanced their daily life. And so people weren't, listening to music just to listen to music, right? You don't listen to music just to watch the record spin, we used to say. But what they were using it for, iPhones were becoming a bit more common. iPods had been around for a long time, and people were using those mobile music listening devices to listen to music when they worked out, or in the car, or when they wake up, or when they go to sleep, or they need to set the vibe for a romantic evening, et cetera, et cetera. And so it occurred to us that maybe we were thinking about a music service in the wrong way. We were thinking about building a music service for music aficionados, not a lifestyle enhancing service for general consumers. And that was the first pivot that really started to lay the foundation for what would be the next phase, which is what really resonated. And so once we repositioned our thinking of this product as a lifestyle enhancement service, we built up this huge library of expert human curated playlists for any mood, situation, genre, decade, all these unique things. We had some interesting categories of playlists that we eventually sort of deprecated or moved around, like record store clerk, the kinds of playlists that you might go into a cool record store and ask the guy behind the counter, like, what kind of music should I buy or listen to? And they would kind of size you up and be like, oh, you're kind of, you like to explore new kinds of music, but at the end of the day, the stuff that you like is just pop music, has properties of pop music. So let's get you to indie music that's not too weird. And so that was kind of like a category or a playlist. And so we got to experiment with those kinds of things. And we found that people really liked the playlists, but they weren't necessarily willing to do the work to find them. So in my particular memory of this, we used to go to a lot of tech startup demo days and tech meetups and things like that to show people our products, get feedback, maybe network and meet investors or whomever. And I remember that every time we would do this, I would take people through the user experience of finding a playlist on Songza. And I did it so many times that eventually it became very clear that there were major improvements that we could make to that. And so the reason that I think we all mutually landed on this in some way, shape, or form from our different individual experiences and just talking about it with one another. But what I noticed is that I would ask people, okay, I would say, this is Songza. We have the perfect playlist for any occasion. What do you like to listen to music for? And they might say working out or having dinner or driving. And I would say, great. This is how you find the perfect playlist for that particular thing that you like music for. So first thing you need to do is hit browse. And then you scroll and find working out. And then you pick a genre within working out. And then here, pick from 100 different rap workout playlists that you think you might like based on the title. And then I might sort of talk with that person to understand which one I think they might want. They'd pick the playlist and then they'd be like, oh, cool. This seems like the kind of playlist that I might want to listen to while working out. And you can see how doing that over and over again with dozens of people, even just in the course of the same night, my voice was getting tired in that much instruction. And so it was fairly obvious that there could be a lot of human that sort of human guidance could potentially be scaled in a way that gets people to music that's more relevant for them in a personal way much faster than that current version of Songza. And that was one, that's sort of my unique lane into how we might have shaped that. If you talk to anyone else who was around, they probably had slightly different experiences, but all of our sort of cumulative experience and insight and sort of user quotes, so to speak, informed that next phase. And what that meant for us was taking this sort of Frankenstein product, if you will, something that was pretty complicated to use and maybe was designed for a broad swath of people, and focusing it in the most minimal way possible in ways that actually would exclude certain audiences that we had been accustomed to serving. And that really scared us. I remember we came up with the design for what we called the music concierge. And the music concierge was basically the core Songza that most people know, in which you arrive on your mobile phone or your computer and it says, it's name the time of the day and the day part. What do you need music for? And it would give you 5 super relevant activities or situations that you could need music for at that time. And it would dynamically change based on the time of the day of the week, the weather, whatever holiday it might have been, current events, et cetera, partnerships that we were doing, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a very dynamic way of getting you to hyper relevant music during multiple times throughout your day. And we were very scared that we would be alienating people who wanted to listen to artist radio stations or make their own playlists or have social playlisting, et cetera, et cetera. But we had done so much research. We had so many rounds and iterations of creating music services that we were willing to sort of bet on leaning so heavily into this direction. And I think it was a good thing that we were scared. Like, I remember right before we launched it, one of my co-founders and I were walking home to the subway and we're like, this could be the end, because it's so drastically different, focused, and potentially alienating that it could just it could just alienate our base. And luckily it didn't. It kind of took off immediately, first with the tech scene. So timing was really great too. We launched the first version of Songza, the music concierge, if you will, and we demoed it at the New York Tech Meetup. Soon thereafter, we got a lot of attention there as one of the standout demos. TechCrunch reporter found us and wrote us up that next day. My co-founder and I appeared on TechCrunch TV the next day, and the adoption amongst tech's early adopters and the tech press was rolling. As when we launched the iPhone app and got some pretty good traction, and then still we're staying very relevant and top of mind, and ended up getting in touch with Apple's editorial team. And folks who've worked with Apple's editorial team know that that's a very privileged relationship to have for a young startup company. And the fact that we had caught their attention and they had reached out to us was really promising. And so we started talking to them about developing an iPad app, and stayed really close with them on how we were developing it and when it was going to come out and what kind of accompanying promotion and marketing we were planning. And we decided, and once we finished it, we set up an exclusive review with a reporter at TechCrunch under embargo. And we told Apple, we said, okay, on Monday we're going to release the app, and TechCrunch is going to run this review. What else do you need to know from us? And this was on a Thursday. And if you're familiar with Apple in the App Store, they refresh the banners and the promotional slots on Thursday afternoons Eastern time. And they called us that same day and said, why don't you release it today? And when Apple says something very cryptic like that to you as a young developer who knows that being featured on the iTunes App Store could be game changing, you do what they say. And lucky for us, it was a good thing. They featured us on the top banner on the front page of the App Store. We toasted with champagne. And just so happened we were going to the first ever Queens Tech meetup in Long Island City, where we were based that same day. So the whole team was wearing matching Songza shirts. We were toasting champagne. We were on the front page of the iTunes Store. We got to be sort of an inaugural presenter at the first ever Queens Tech meetup, which Alexis Ohanian was also sort of like the headline speaker, so to speak. And it was a really nice kind of victory lap for us, having been based in Queens at that point for 6 years or something like that, having had so many failures with our download store and all the experiments with different songs, we thought we were finally on the path to having a product that resonated really well with consumers. And from then on, the next couple days were fueled by adrenaline and excitement, and a lot of exhaustion as well, because our app crashed. Millions of people were trying to download it, and we quadrupled the user base that we had accumulated over that 6 years in 10 days time. So it was, and that was the beginning of a really interesting couple of years that eventually led to the Google acquisition. So that's kind of the background on the long background on Songza, if you will.
I love it. I love it. I mean, that whole journey speaks to itself, and I appreciate you kind of digging through that. So many questions, but there's a few things that I want to touch on. To start off, just to recap a little bit of your early journey, you had 4 different models. You had 4 different products or features, so to say, within the platform, from downloads to radio to social listening, etc. And you decided to simplify all of that and say, let's scrap all of that and go back to what are we hearing from users, and in the demos that we're doing, what is the experience that we are constantly going to. Just that kind of trade-off between boiling the ocean, so to say, versus saying this is the one experience we're going to focus on. How did it become that, and how did you gain the conviction that this is that one experience?
Well, I think a lot of it had to do with what we learned directly from all of these different services and experiments that we had done over the years. And then another dimension was, our advisors and investors. Some of which had been with us since the early days, like before I was even on board. And there's a certain level of expectation from an advisor and investor standpoint with how a company is going to use their money and what it's going to turn into over time. So there's always that kind of pressure to manifest the originally forecasted ROI, so to speak. And the longer that things go sort of under promising, the more kinds of anxiety comes with it. And so, I think there were some good steers along the way, externally, and marrying that with directly what we're hearing from users, both through product analytics as well as the direct conversational, more qualitative data, um, led to all of the decisions that we made to move forward. And I think when it came to the hyper focused version of Songza that we call the concierge, I think we decided that we needed to take that approach. One, we had decided that on-demand streaming was not something that we were going to do. It was very expensive. It requires a lot of dollars to license catalogs to be able to do that, which means hiring like really expensive people who have those relationships and can write large checks to record companies and publishers. And it also meant that our focus would then have to be dedicated to the licensing component, whereas doing things that are DMCA compliant, which is what the radio licensing is, requires a bit less money. First of all, you pay on a per stream basis, and versus like paying advances. And then it also required fewer organizations that you had to have contracts in place with in an individual country, to launch in. So in the United States, we just had to have contracts in place with the performing rights organizations, which are CSAC. Oh man, I'm forgetting some of these. So I won't try to get into that, but the performing rights organizations, ASCAP, CSAC, and there's a third, which I'm forgetting. It's been a while. And then we also eventually launched in Canada and had deals in place with the equivalents there. So if we had done on demand, we would have had to do deals with every single record company and publisher, plus ASCAP, CSAC, and the other performing rights organization that I've failed to remember. So we didn't want to be spending all of our time doing licensing, and we didn't want to raise a ton of money to be spending on licensing. We wanted to be focusing our time on building cool products that people would like and want to use. So that helped us focus initially. Then the second thing that helped us focus was those user insights, and really that understanding that most people, most of the time, just want to get to good music that helps enhance the activity that they're doing. And they want it fast. They don't want to be doing the mental math of deciding what artist or song maps to the activity that they're doing. Because one, it requires some heavy lifting from a mental perspective. Like, so for instance, if I'm working out and I know that the best workout song for me is always going to be Born to Run by Bruce Springsteen, I might still have to do that mental math. So I would say, okay, I'm working out. I want to feel this kind of energy. Therefore, this artist is something that I associate with that energy. And this song by this artist is the song that can best deliver on that energy. So that's initial mental math. The next piece of mental math is, well, what do I listen to next after that one song? And then the next piece that we found problematic was how stale that could get very easily. So every time I work out, the first thing that I think of is Born to Run by Bruce Springsteen. But I don't always want to hear Born to Run by Bruce Springsteen while I'm working out. There's some level of variety that I think I could experience. And there's some level of discoverability. I might want to find a new song that is going to make me feel a different way while I'm working out, but not realize that that's the kind of thing that's going to make my workout spicier, or more interesting. And so in having these kinds of insights, it helped us design a product that both could operate within the confines of radio licensing rules and also deliver on the core immediate needs of music listeners in the contextual listening environment. And so it made sense that that it didn't matter the order of the songs, and that it would be on shuffle and you might hear different songs every single time you heard it, because the vibe was consistent and the feeling that it elicited was consistent and designed for that specific context. And what ended up becoming kind of the special sauce for Songza was the machine learning that we put into it. So once you have your initial experience with Songza, it started to learn more and more about your tastes, about the kinds of stuff that you like when you would give us a thumbs up or just listen to, more and more songs on that playlist. We would start to feed you things that are consistently in line with what we know you're going to like in that context. So if you consistently listen to coffee shop indie on Monday, on every morning during the week when you work, we would make sure to surface options for situations you could drill into that would include coffee shop indie or similar kinds of playlists. And that would change based on your mid-afternoon activities and your workout activities and nighttime activities and weekend activities, et cetera, et cetera. And so there were some really interesting data science applications once we brought on the concierge and got an initial sort of huge critical mass of users and started to iterate on sort of the final foundational version of Songza.
Yeah, and that's the part that I always found interesting, and why I loved the app so much was, while it had that element of feedback and, as I liked some songs, it would feed me more of that or those activities. It also made discovery so easy because, what are you doing right now? I don't have to think about that, or there's like the mental math, like you said, is very low there. Like, okay, I'm working out. I know I'm working out. So I click that. And then it tells me, are you feeling energized or pumped or whatever? What kind of music do you want? And so that helps me navigate to discovery where I don't have to think about like, oh, I want to listen to hidden gems from the 90s. But
Mm.
how do I arrive at that answer? By answering some simple questions.
Yes,
Um,
discovery for us was not just about new music; it was also about rediscovery. Because there are certain
mm,
times when throwback '90s jams are just the perfect thing, but they're maybe not top of mind every day.
yeah.
Or there's a lot of different. That's too what I liked about songs as an avid, lifelong music discovery nerd, if you will, was that it would turn me on to all kinds of new genres of music that I had never heard of, because we had employed a stable of music experts, people who were journalists or academics or producers, music supervisors, um, editorial musicians, you name it. When you get that kind of group of people, their knowledge of music is incredible, and they were able to expose me to so many different kinds of music that I had never heard of before. And I am just so musically adventurous that I would, even if it was presented to me in a particular context, that was usually the best way to discover it. Hanging out at the beach, I'd be like, oh, I could listen to something new and interesting now, and I would discover something new, and that would become a go-to for me, and I would probably listen to it in other instances when I wasn't just hanging out at the beach. Um, so for me, that was a very serendipitous personal music discovery experience, and I've heard similar kinds of experiences from users like yourself and many others that have really interesting music discovery experiences with songs, or just music consumption experiences with Songza. So that was a highly rewarding thing, kind of feedback to hear about Songza.
And in terms of what was feeding these playlists and coming up with it, you mentioned you used some amount of machine learning, but then you also had experts who knew genres, who knew different parts of music, who came from different backgrounds, and who could come up with these. What I want to understand a bit about is, what was the scalability of a product like that, where you had to constantly be coming up with new playlists and new genres, and there is constantly new music coming up. How does the manual, experts coming up with playlist part of it scale as the user base scales?
I think it's interesting because early on, before anyone used this product, our goal was to have the most comprehensive library of music on the internet, or library of playlists rather. So we did a lot of desk research to make sure that we were covering all of the most important corners of music that people were consuming from a genre perspective. And then from there, we got to learn what resonated. And often what resonated were pretty generic things like today's pop hits. And with something like today's pop hits, that can be utilized in a lot of different contexts. People might want to listen to today's pop hits when they're waking up or when they're working out or when they're driving or just background music for work. And so you're able to see how people are reacting to it in those different contexts. And with a playlist like that or a genre playlist like that, most of the work is really just upkeep based on what's performing well, and also just what's factual, like what's highest on the Billboard charts is what's going to be on that playlist, because oftentimes people are listening to it just to find out what's popular, not necessarily to find out like what's the best song for me. Other playlists were more curated and updated based on what users were confirming was the ideal, like matched the vibe for the context. So like something that this isn't an actual thing that happened, but I would imagine, a hyper contextual playlist like Beach Blanket Bingo wouldn't necessarily be. We would probably make adjustments to it, like which songs would stay and which songs would get added based on how people were voting on the song, so to speak. Whereas something like today's pop hits or 90s one hit wonders, those are very binary song choices. It's like it either is or it isn't, whether or not people like it or not. So there are a lot of those kinds of considerations that you had to make on an individual playlist basis. And that the consumption also informed what new kinds of playlists we commissioned or decided to make. So for instance, if we saw that our audience really loved high energy music and they really loved stuff in the indie music that's not too weird genre, we would try to make sure that we had enough high energy indie music that's not too weird for many different situations, and that would show up in many different places, and we would make sure that we had the most comprehensive sort of subset of playlists in that subgenre and build it out that way, and maybe deprioritize some more esoteric genres or things that weren't getting chosen as much or that didn't have as high a user satisfaction or listening time ratio, because we noticed that it just wasn't as useful as a lifestyle enhancing playlist as some of the other things. But it was important for us to still keep it there, to make sure that it still represented the broad selection and the level of depth that we were able to go. So people would find, there were still a lot of instances where I think individually I might hear from users that, yeah, sure, they listen to some of our most popular playlists the most, but they also like to get into some really interesting micro, hyper contextual micro genre, like, I don't know, this isn't an actual playlist, but Congolese rumba for dinner parties. People would still have that more well-rounded list of favorite playlists that wasn't just limited to one genre or one type of playlist. They like to have both things that were familiar, things that were new, things that were broad, things that were hyper contextual, and everything in between.
One of the things I want to chat a bit about is the monetization side of Songza. You mentioned that there's obviously, a cost component to this. You're streaming music, and whatever the levels there are of like direct songs versus playlists and etc. There is some cost component. So how were you thinking of the monetization component? Because as far as I remember, the app was always free for users.
Yeah, so part of how we arrived at our monetization structure was the previous stuff that we had been doing with downloads. We couldn't do. So with downloading, what we had done was actually dynamic pricing, in which songs started for free or very inexpensive and increased in price the more that they were purchased, and we would split the revenue with the content providers. And so when you're working in a streaming environment, you can't really do that because people aren't paying for the music most of the time. It's ad supported. And so we had always been doing like very light advertising by means of running display ads and things through ad networks. When we started to get more critical mass and interest from advertisers and media agencies, et cetera, we built out a sales team and a bit more of a robust suite of monetization levers. So advertising was the core, and we had always had advertising networks. We made it a bit more robust by adding what we called native advertising integrations, as a buzzword at the time. But basically working with brands to create content on the service. So, if you were Nike and you wanted to reach users who met the sort of demographic and psychographic profile of Songza users, we would partner with you to build a playlist or set of playlists, or even what we call the situation, designed for enhancing the moment or set of moments that you as a brand want to own or want people to associate you with. And so we would work with brands in that way and create even more robust strategic partnerships with them, with cross promotion, working in artist partnerships that we had with them or that they had brought to the table, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a lot of variety on what we did there. And then the last component was subscription. So we added a subscription tier called Club Songza, in which people could pay to remove all ads and have unlimited skips, which was another constraint of the radio rules. You could only skip 6 times per hour, as to avoid on-demand listening capabilities. So no ads and unlimited skips, and I forget what we charged actually. But it was a pretty inexpensive subscription, and some of our most loyal users really appreciated that. So we had a mix of revenue coming in from sort of advertising networks, more native and strategic advertising and cross-promotional partnerships, and then the subscription tier as well.
You talked about the growth of Songza and how the app really took off, and how you saw benefits from being featured in the App Store and other partnerships. When did Google come knocking at your door? And of course, as much as you can reveal, how did that partnership and acquisition come about? And internally at Songza, what was the feeling about that deal?
After about 2 years 2 years after we launched the Music Concierge and sort of took off, we realized that in order to grow to the scale that we needed to be on the long-term trajectory we needed, we either needed to raise a ton of money at a really high valuation, or get acquired by a larger business that had the infrastructure to be able to scale this kind of business, the sort of international infrastructure required, the money, the expertise required to be able to scale and maybe even, dip into the on-demand world, streaming. And so it became pretty apparent to us that we didn't want to be raising tons of money at a high valuation. We'd been in the startup game for a long time, 8 years at that point, and we were a little bit burnt out and really just wanted to not have to worry about the sort of scrappy challenges of being a startup anymore. And so it was at that point that we started to re-engage with companies that had been talking to us over the years about potential acquisition down the line. And around that same time, Google had been, they had launched Google Play Music primarily as this cloud locker service. Eventually they added on-demand functionality, but I think they weren't completely satisfied with its with how it worked. And I think there was an expectation internally that it would be more akin to what you would expect from Google search and maps, etc., but for music. And it wasn't delivering on that because it wasn't creating really great contextually relevant music that was dynamic and shifting with your lifestyle. They did have on-demand functionality and locker functionality, but it wasn't growing in a way that was super promising, and it didn't really live up to Google's sort of product expectations for what a music service by Google should be. And so when a company is faced with that kind of dilemma, it's like, okay, well, what is it that you want to build? How much is it going to cost to build it ourselves versus go out and acquire it? And so the intersection of the state of Google at that time and where we were made for a good fit, partially because we'd worked with Google for years with the Google Play team. They were an affiliate partner of ours. You could, when you were listening to a song on Songza, we had links for Android phone owners to click through and buy the song from the Google Play Music Store. And we'd also worked with their App Store team and developer relations on, developing for Android, being featured in the store, and being included in other kinds of promotional events and press that they were doing for developers. Plus, we knew people there, we had good relationships, and it became clear in conversations that we shared a vision for what the future of music and music streaming could be. And that led to the long conversations and negotiations about acquisition, and then eventually telling the broader team and sets of shareholders that Google had given us a letter of intent, and we were going to probably be acquired by Google, and all the formality that goes with that, interviewing individual people on our team, negotiating for full-time headcount for the majority of our team, or at least partial, contracts for 6 months or a year for some of the folks that Google didn't initially want to bring on, many of which were able to find full-time headcount and are still at Google. So overall, the cultural transition to Google, the onboarding to Google was by and large successful and seamless. because of that sort of shared philosophy and a lot of the shared values and cultural things. Plus, in many ways, it was a lifestyle upgrade. We didn't have to worry about, paying our bills and raising money. We had a much better office space or set of office spaces that we had access to. The Google perks that you've heard about, which some of which aren't there anymore, but the free food, the team offsites, a lot of these things were nice sort of changes of pace for us when we first started there. And especially the times, with the Google Play Music folks, I think we had a really good relationship with some of those initial folks that we started to work with internally at Google, many of which I know a lot of folks still work with or keep in touch with, and generally had a very good sort of acquisition and migration experience in those early days.
Great. Yeah, makes sense. I think the vision, like you're saying, still stood, and the vision was always, how do we get our music experience in front of the most people possible? And there's startup scale, and then there's Google scale. So it's definitely a faster way to get to that, and of course all the other things around that don't hurt as well. Last question. I don't want to keep you for too long. Looking back, this was a 8 to 10 year journey for you. Is there anything that you would have done differently, or you would change if you had to do it again?
It's a tough question to answer because there's nothing that I could change because it's all in the past. When I look at it now with the perspective that I have, there's definitely a lot that I would change in my approach because I just didn't have the knowledge, experience, or brain trust, if you will, that I do now. And so if I were to, I think for me, the question is less relevant as to what I would change, and more the more relevant question is what I learned that I would use to inform how I would operate a startup or market or grow a startup now moving forward. And I think the biggest lesson that I think if you ask anyone that worked at Songza for more than 2 years, the biggest lesson that we learned was always listen to the voice of the customer and let them lead the way. The rest of the decisions that you have to make, you can do more confidently when you understand what the consumer wants and needs, and what their lifestyle is like. And from there, everything else becomes easier. Product decisions, business decisions, monetization decisions, all of that needs to be focused on the consumer.
That's great. Yeah. Always start and end with the consumer.
It sounds pretty cliche.
But I mean, it's tried and tested, and I think the whole experience that you talked about of how you actually simplified everything talks to the power of that, of actually going back to what did the customer do, rather than thinking from your perspective as like, I'm a music expert, so I want to put all the music, everything out there. It's like, no, the customer just wants this one simple thing. Can we just nail that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Love
it's
that.
being able to take yourself and your opinions out of the picture. And in doing that, over time, you become more aware of your tendencies and your biases, and you become more comfortable in being vulnerable to that, and being able to say, you know what I want here is probably not what's best.
I'm back. Yes.
Good morning, you're back.
We got goodie bags.
Oh, you did? Do you want to come say hi to my friend?
No, I need to take my shoes off.
Okay. That's my son, in case you were wondering.
Great, great, great. No, I won't keep you longer then. Thanks so much for Eric. I mean, this was great and, like great to go down memory lane and understand the journey of Songza. So I appreciate you taking the time.
No problem. Yeah. Nice to talk to you.